Getting back to the scene of the crime, we're speaking to one of my co-workers, Wesley Smith. This also gets us back to the world of graphics, which is kind of always fun to do. One of the things I really wanted to pick Wesley's brain on was how he deals with mathematics as an artist, or art as a mathematician slash programmer guy. I think you'll find his answers pretty fascinating, and if the word math intuition sounds foreign to you, you're probably going to want to listen to this podcast. So thanks on, I'll talk to you at the end. Okay, this week I have got the great opportunity to speak with my colleague Wesley Smith. This is a really exciting opportunity for me, but it's also a timely one. Wes is about to embark on a new project, and so he's not going to be working with me for much longer, and so I thought I'd take the opportunity to grab him while I could kind of browbeat him into it. Wes is an amazing technologist as well as artist. He works primarily in the worlds of OpenGL, and he is one of the primary drivers behind the Gen graphics subsystem within Max. And so with that, I will say hi. Hi, Wes. How are you?
Hey, Darwin.
Thanks a lot for joining me on the podcast. It's really cool.
My pleasure.
Before we get started, why don't you fill everybody in on what you're going to be doing here shortly?
Yeah, so as much as I can say right now is I've been exploring the world of digital fabrication and am jumping into the 3D printing world. So I'll be developing software for 3D printing and see where it takes me. It's going to be an interesting journey.
Yeah, I'll bet it is. It's interesting to hear that you're going into digital fab, because I think of you as a person who has really been super virtualized.
Yeah, that's really true, and part of it is a reaction to that. So it's like I sit in front of my computer all day, and when do I stand up and take a break? It's I kind of lose myself in it, and I just want to get physical with things. And even though I'll be writing software, it has a physical outcome, and there'll be more. It'll just get more and more into reality for me. It's take me away from the computer more.
Sure, absolutely, and you'll actually be able to do stuff that you can drop on your foot now, which is great.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in my podcast, what I generally do is I ask people to start off by giving me a little bit about their background. I know a little bit of yours. It's pretty fascinating, but I'm kind of interested in hearing the full story. So, if you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to be where you are.
Yeah, so I started out being just really interested in photography. That's kind of how I, ended up in the art side of things. But at the same time, I was really into Legos and just playing around with mathematics, and I enjoyed physics in high school, for instance. And so I was struck by something my physics teacher told me when I went to college, which is he did physics because it was the most difficult thing he could think of to study. And so when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to major in, which ended up being electrical engineering, that's kind of the mindset I took to it. And also I thought it would be just useful to understand the technology that is around us in computers and how things function. These days I would probably choose something like biology because things have changed so much, but that's what I chose back in 1998. And I kept doing photography all the time. Like in high school, I took photos, at least a roll of film every week for 3 or 4 years. And then at some point, I bought a 4x5 camera. So I started taking, using the cape and the big tripod and taking more just staged photographs. Mm-hmm. So while I was doing my engineering studies, I went to Johns Hopkins, and they have a relationship with the Maryland Institute College of Art, which is just down the street. So I could take classes there, no problem. So I'd always, every semester, take at least one art class. So I was doing photography, I could use their facilities. And then at some point, I studied abroad in Paris. And didn't study any engineering, just did purely photography and really dove deep into that. And when I graduated, I kind of didn't know what to do because I wanted to combine art and my technological background, my engineering background, but I just didn't know the world of Macs. I didn't know that kind of thing existed. That wasn't exposed to that until my last year. I met Randall Packer. I don't know if you know him at all.
I've heard the name. I don't know personally.
Cycling did an interview with him at one point.
Right.
I'm pretty sure. And so he's used Macs a long time. I think David Ziccarelli wrote the Laserdisc object for him.
the famous Laserdisc object.
Yeah. He used to do mixed media performances in some theaters on Mission Street in SF. But he was in DC, and so that's where I met him in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins. And then after Hopkins, I actually spent a year at the Marin Institute College of Art and just trying to figure out where I was going to go. And he put me in contact with UC Santa Barbara, where the Media Arts and Technology program was starting up. And so that's how I ended up out there, and I spent about 6 years there and ended up all but dissertation with my PhD because other things happened. I started working for cycling for one. I was doing, I think I started working for cycling after my first year at MAT, just as a part-time thing. Oh, and then it became more serious. There was like an opportunity to do full-time. And so I had these competing interests, like, should I do full-time? I really like this job. It's fantastic. It's a lot of fun to work with everyone. But at the same time, I'm, having fun exploring this stuff. And eventually I left UC Santa Barbara and moved to SF to work for cycling.
Sure. Okay. Wow. That's a very interesting trail. I didn't realize that you had the background in photography that you did.
Yeah.
That's
so
really cool.
At some point in Baltimore, I learned about jitter. So I took a class called, what is it called? Intermedia Studio, I believe,
right.
From Randall.
Right.
And Luc Dubois came and presented jitter a couple months before it came out.
Right.
So we were using NATO, of course. That was my first. I can actually say I used NATO in a project. My first project used NATO, and then jitter obviously was so much easier because the documentation was ridiculous on NATO.
Right.
And I started doing video performances. The one that I from that era that I really like a lot was using a one-way mirror to optically mix a computer monitor and a old school television where you could jiggle the frequencies between channels and get the vertical hold moving and stuff like that.
Oh, okay, sure.
So that was my controller, and then I had jitter running using the Eclipse, Jitter Eclipse, when it was all the
right.
And I had some color cycling going on, and it was feeding back onto the one-way mirror where the television and the jitter processing were mixing.
Right.
And there was so the camera was picking that up.
Right.
And what was really interesting about that is because you could only do 320 by 240 video back in that time. What I would do is I'd have the television in perfectly sharp focus, and obviously that's like super high resolution because it's reality in a certain way. And I would defocus the jitter a little bit, the feedback, the processing from jitter, so you wouldn't see the pixel boundaries.
Sure.
And since you saw this very sharp image of the television, everything just looked super high res.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was, and so I would just improvise, and sometimes you get Monday Night Football, sometimes you get PBS, ballet, Baryshnikov on there, and I just play with the patterns as they developed.
Right. Well, that's really interesting. It's fun it's fun also, though maybe a little irritating to think back of some of the limitations we put up with and the tricks that we took advantage of in order to kind of make our work seem maybe technically better than it was.
Just to give it not to like get distracted by, things that people might hone in on because they see, it's just a bunch of, small pixels, know.
It's so pixelated it can't be any good, right?
Yeah. There's lots of people who work with that as well, but that's not something I was trying to work with.
Sure. So now you primarily are known within the cycling world for being sort of heavy-duty OpenGL and then for doing all of the craziness that is Jen.
Yes.
Nothing about that implies a background in photography, right?
No.
There's massive amounts of math and stuff. Now, you said that you went to school for engineering because it was kind of the hardest thing that you could imagine doing.
Correct.
When you first got into OpenGL, was it primarily because it was a difficult puzzle, or were you
It was
drawn there for other reasons?
it was more just to, that's how you could draw things, right? And
Mm,
quickly. So my progression is, so I did photography, and then that kind of led into video, right?
right.
And then real-time video. And then when I got to Santa Barbara, I was introduced to lots of concepts about architecture and virtual reality, and things became more spatial. So it became more about drawing things in dimensionally and 3D graphics because of that.
I see.
So it's
Yeah.
kind of like a progression in that sense. And if you think about it now it's okay. 3D printing, physical. It's
Right.
like pretty clear succession of topics, I guess you would call it.
Right. I guess so. That's
Subject
true.
matter.
Right.
And yeah, so I didn't really learn programming that much in undergraduate. I just, we did a little bit of assembly, but we didn't go too deep. And I learned enough C to be dangerous, but not do anything crazy. And we didn't learn anything about manipulating audio or graphics. So that's a totally different kind of programming.
Right.
And so at Santa Barbara, since I had just I was really learning jitter, I thought I was getting pretty good at it. And I wanted to get deeper because there were some limitations into how you can work with the jitter matrices
Mm-hmm.
in terms of arranging data and building dynamic structures.
Right.
So I was like, okay, I'm going to learn C and learn how to write jitter external. So I got my roommate, August, who also works for Cycling 74.
Yeah. Right.
So he and I were roommates for 6 years in Santa Barbara,
Oh,
5
I didn't
years.
know that. That's hilarious.
Yeah. So he knew C a lot better than I did at the time. So he taught me how to read the jitter SDK. And then I made my first objects. And eventually I think I made 20-something objects called the X-ray objects. And yeah, so that's kind of how I just got into it. I was like, okay, I need to do something, so let's learn it. And I have a tendency to really try to learn everything I can. So I just kind of practice, I don't know how many years I've been programming OpenGL, but it's just practice every day, basically.
Right. Right. It's like an instrument almost, right?
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is that the first time I heard your name was when Josh was talking about hiring you at Cycling, and he was like, "Yeah, I'm really thinking of working with Wesley. Everybody just loves working with him and loves his work." And I'm like, He's like, "Yeah, he did the X-ray stuff." And I'm like, "Oh, the X-ray guy."
Yeah.
Because you got pretty well known for those. Those were,
Yeah.
it kind of provided a fairly unique way of approaching some of that jitter functionality.
Yeah, so there was a couple like greatest hits from that. There was like 20-something objects, probably 15 of which were really quirky and specific to what I was doing.
Uh-huh.
And then there's the time cube one, which lets you do slit scan style manipulation of video. And that was obviously, who doesn't love a good slit scan?
Who doesn't love a good slit scan? That's right.
And then there was another one, X-ray JIT water, which did a pretty fast and really nice. It wasn't limited to a water simulation like you do with the convolution example. It comes with jitter.
Right.
You could vary the temporal resolution as well as the spatial resolution and the speed at which the wave propagated per pixel. So that gave people a lot of fun. It's always fun to play with water simulations. Fluid simulations is just, you can't go wrong.
So do you still maintain the X-ray objects?
I every once in a while I get someone asking me about something. Maybe I haven't compiled it for 64-bit or for Windows, or something random like that. And that I will then find where I have the source code stashed. Maybe it's not on my most recent computer. Maybe I have to go to an old hard drive. and try to compile it. And usually I can get it done in like a pretty good, easy. So yeah, I do. They're online in the Max Objects database.
Sure.
And I think they're still on my really super old UC Santa Barbara website. I think that's where the link takes you.
Oh,
Man,
interesting.
it's a terrible website. So
Well,
don't judge me.
don't judge you based on that. Well,
No, but the objects are there, and and the thing that happened after that is the Boids.
right.
So I think Eric Singer had this Max Boids object, and it was super slow if you had a huge list, right? Because you're working with max lists with those.
Right.
So then I ported it to Jitter to use matrices, and then it became super fast.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize you were involved in that, but it makes sense. Now, at Santa Barbara, they did a lot of. You kind of just off the cuff said, you kind of like learned about architecture and some of this stuff, but Santa Barbara's got kind of some notoriety behind sort of like large format virtual realities, right?
Yeah, because of the allosphere, the giant ball that looks like an X-Men set.
Yeah. Were you involved with that at all?
I did. I was there when they built it and started setting it up, and we moved into the Nanosystems, the California Nanosystems building, which is where it's housed.
Okay.
Before we were in a humanities building where the math people are and some other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, we moved out there, and now we're in labs where people are growing iguana feet follicles to simulate stickiness and all. It's like crazy stuff going on in there.
Yeah.
And then so it's a big virtual reality 360 by 360, I guess, spherical system with huge amounts of channels of audio. But I was just there when the things were getting off the ground, and I wasn't around as much when they got the system really running, and that's some, yeah.
But you obviously were there for some of the planning and like mock-ups and stuff for what it could do, right?
Yeah, so we actually developed some of the early prototypes of like, how would things work in Jitter. So that's why I put the stereoscopic 3D stuff in Jitter and some other things like that. And in the end, we developed a thing called Cosm, which I presented at the first Max Expo.
Yeah.
And so we developed this ambisonics with Graham and I. Graham has also co-developed Gen with me, so he did Gen Tilde.
Right.
And so we developed Cosm, and what's really nice about Cosm is that you could attach sounds to spatial locations and then also draw objects with them. So you could say, okay, I have this sound, put it in this location, and attach it to this visual OpenGL object, and move it around, and you'll get Doppler shift, you'll get dampening from distance, and it do this spatialization using ambisonics.
Interesting.
So it was really well integrated, and then you could switch between stereoscopic mode or just normal. You could do multiple windows. It was really it did a lot of things that now you can do in Max 7 in a simpler way, or even Max 6, because there's physics now on Max.
Right.
There's JIT.world. There's a lot of other things that simplify doing these kind of, I don't know.
Yeah,
complicated sequences of objects.
I hadn't even thought about it, but when you did the Cosm stuff, none of that physics stuff was in place. You were kind of having to develop that all from whole cloth. Yeah.
Yeah, and then also Graham and I worked on the thing called Lua AV, which was an audiovisual real-time programming environment using the Lua scripting language.
Yeah, I remember when you did that. What was it about Lua that drew you to that language?
First of all, it's super small, so the language itself is 200K. So it's embedded in, you can embed it in your app, and it takes up no space whatsoever. It's used in video game development a lot because of that.
I see. Well, it's funny because I was goofing around with some Android development, and I ended up stumbling across this Corona Labs group. And they use Lua for everything, and so in order to just play around with it, I got a chance to use Lua a little bit. Yeah. Fun little language.
It's pretty fun. It's a little bit verbose to do live coding,
Yeah.
because you have to type in these long words like keywords all the time, like
Right.
function and stuff. But it's a fantastic language. It's super small. Like, there's like one data structure. You don't have to
Yeah.
learn a lot to get started, and it's multi-paradigm. So you can do procedural, you can do functional, you
Right.
can do a bunch of different ways of styles of programming.
Yeah. The one thing I found is that its method for doing like object-oriented stuff kind of broke my head.
Yeah, well, it's a prototype language similar to
Yeah.
JavaScript, but
Right.
it doesn't come with an object model from the start, so everyone rolls their own, and that's kind of one of the downsides of it. So there hasn't really been a community that's pushed a standard set of libraries. There's
Uh-huh.
kind of is, but it's not nothing like what you have with Node.js or Ruby Gems or anything like that.
Right. Yeah.
Um, but what we really liked about it is that it integrates super well with C and C++.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way Lua AV worked is we added, and also Lua had coroutines. So coroutines is like a function, you call it, but you can pause the execution of the function in the middle, do something else, and then resume it. So you can kind of think of it
Sure.
as a function that's scheduled, where you can do different things over time.
Yeah.
And we had both. You could pause. Let's say you had a loop that played 10 notes.
Mm-hmm.
So you could pause the for loop for like a tenth of a second and then play the next note and then the next note. And you just write this one little loop that plays 10 notes, but it'll play them out over time.
Right.
Or you could say wait for an event. So you could wait for some kind of like, someone clicks a button on the window, a mouse button on the window, and then play the next note. You can do all these different kinds of asynchronous or synchronous type timing.
Yeah.
And then in the back end, because, there's first of all it's multi-threaded, so there's some running some DSP audio stuff, and then there's the graphics. And the way it worked is that we used LLVM, which is the low-level virtual machine, to JIT compile DSP code to run super fast audio.
Mm-hmm.
So in Lua, you describe some kind of unit generator,
Okay.
and we translate that into C++ code, compile it, and run it in the audio thread.
Uh-huh.
And then you could call those from Lua. So you could schedule the unit generators to play for certain amounts of time and change the parameters and do all this kind of stuff and mix those with the graphics. So
So you literally were flying back and forth between Lua code and C code on the fly as you needed.
But you as a author of a script never saw that.
Right, right. That's really interesting, but that also sounds like the perfect precursor to the whole gen mechanism.
Yeah, it basically is what we took a lot of the same work, ideas and ways of working with LLVM and generating code to put it into Gen. Yeah.
Right. So now moving to the gen world, it's kind of interesting to see how that's developed because it really started off as kind of a way to do low level. I mean, for me, the thing I liked about it is it changed my interaction with. I use Gen a lot, so it changed my interactions with the pixels of a frame. I
Yeah.
tend to think of jitter as kind of a frame-oriented processing system,
Yeah.
and Gen allowed me to get more involved in pixel processing, which I really really like.
Yeah. That's really exciting. And when I've taught workshops,
Mm-hmm.
People who are afraid to go into GLSO code and work on fragment shaders or obviously who wants to go write a jitter object in C? It's just a pain. And it's not a pain because it's bad design. It's just a pain to write something like that in C in general because
Well,
you have to deal with all the different matrix types. There's 4 types. There's multiple dimensions. There's multiple channels. It's just like a combinatorial explosion, and it just makes you want to like slam. You just don't want to do it.
Well, and the other thing is, and I have to admit that I am totally of this class, but working in Macs kind of spoils you from one standpoint, which is you get away from the whole edit, compile, test mode.
Yeah.
You're testing while you're programming and all this stuff, and all of a sudden to stop the flow and say, well, okay, I'm going to get into this, loop where I'm iteratively adding or testing functionality. it seems like all of a sudden, it's like you got a car boot put on or something, right?
Yeah, totally.
It really seems to slow the turnaround on making stuff happen.
Yeah, so that was also a motivation for writing Lua AV. I just wanted to experiment and see stuff and not have to think about the details of how all this stuff works. In a scripting language, you don't have to think about types and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And then same thing in Gen. You don't have to think about, what are my inputs? Are they like 3D matrices? Are they 2D? You just kind of do it, and everything just works, unless there's a bug, of course.
Of course.
But everything just works, and you can play around with it and see it on the fly. It's a really fantastic medium to like try and play around with the pixels and generating patterns in the matrices and stuff.
Right. Now, in the jitter part of Gen, you continued kind of the jitter standard of conflating the OpenGL and the standard image processing into sort of like one object. But I was actually kind of surprised when Gen was first getting rolled out that there was also going to be a Gen for audio. And I'm wondering how hard it was to come up with a paradigm that would work with not only with the already pretty diverse worlds of image processing and OpenGL, but then also this completely other world of audio.
It's actually not that bad, because in the end, a gen patch is nothing but a function. It's an expression that takes some kind of input and output. And since things are dynamically generated, like say, okay, here I have a sample coming into my input, and I can just push that information through the graph,
right,
and generate the appropriate code. And if I have a matrix, it's a different kind of information that I propagate through the graph, and it generates this other kind of code. So it's the fact that it's like dynamically compiled that really makes that surprisingly easy.
Mm-hmm.
And also there's a big difference between how gen patchers work and max objects, in that the gen objects, you can put arbitrary expressions inside as arguments. So there's a lot more freedom in terms of like how you construct the patcher itself because of this.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense, because if I really think then too, one of the things that always kind of breaks my head a little bit, because I come from a background of working with audio. Audio is really streaming data, right? You very much think of audio as a stream.
Yeah.
You tend to think of images as much more of frames, and then OpenGL stuff to me is like blocks of data. But now if I think about how I interact with them within Gen, it does seem like everything also does kind of boil down into a streamed kind of a function.
Yeah, you can imagine it conceptually as just taking all of your pixels in the image and just putting them in one line,
right,
and pretending those are audio samples, and that's what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's happening in parallel, but that's totally just an implementation issue.
Right.
Conceptually, you can think of it that way.
Sure. Now, when you do workshops or when you're teaching people how to get into this stuff,
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever teach anything at a beginner level, or do you always kind of assume a certain high level of facility?
Yes, I have taught an intro to jitter workshop before Gen existed, actually. And I haven't done that many workshops at that point. And it's difficult to like know how to break people into Max. I assume they knew Max at least, right?
Right.
So I was just kind of explaining to them the details, and it was pretty good. I was able to like get across to a lot of people, most of the class, like how things were working, and I got a lot of good feedback from it. But honestly, the most fun for me is when I have people who are advanced already, and I don't have to slow down to explain like what a message box is and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And so I taught a workshop at Beck in Norway.
Yeah.
In February last year, and that was the most amazing workshop I've ever taught. Not because I necessarily did had this amazing didactic style, but because the students were all professionals using Max in their own work on a day-to-day basis. They're artists, you're doing in theater or video production of some kind, doing interactive installations. And so they were, for one, really motivated, and two, they were just like intensely focused on learning.
Right.
And I could just kind of whip through the Gen stuff, even though that was largely new to them. I think half the class had to buy Gen for the workshop because they hadn't used it before.
Okay.
But afterwards, that was all they were working with, you know, because it was really meeting this like need of I want to customize
Right.
the processing and not lose the efficiency that, you know, I need to realize the project in real time. And especially when I showed them the GLPix object for doing the fragment shader stuff,
Right.
because you get such high resolution, you can do really nice procedural graphics with GLPix. People were just like blown away by it and just like really super into. And so we explored a lot of different pattern generation techniques there. And I also introduced some of the physics objects and how to use Gen with physics, and that just like, you know, it really lit a lot of fires and it was great.
Now you say that you don't know that it was successful because of your style, but I have to admit that having seen you kind of do presentations a couple of times, you do have a pretty unique and fun style. If nothing else, I'll never forget when you did one of your presentations at that first Max Expo. I was actually in another room sitting through this thing about programming Max objects in C, and I walk into the main room, and you had 150 people howling, laughing as you were up on stage, kind of raising the roof, and you had like donuts spinning inside of donuts and stuff like that. And it was a lot of fun. You seem to bring a lot of fun, a lot of levity to working with these highly technical issues. Is it something that you just kind of feel naturally in your gut? Or do you work hard at trying to find fun ways to deal with this technology?
I think I just really enjoy it. You know, I like doing this stuff. I like working with the software, and writing software to me is about learning how to understand something.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can write a program to do something and it works, that means I understand the concept. And I really take a lot of pleasure in that. So that's like, a very strong love right there.
Sure.
And that's just, I was presenting the COSM stuff, I believe, at that presentation. And I just, I was really happy with how the objects came out and all the things you could do in such a simple way. And I think that's just why it came off that way.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Have you ever done any performance or anything like that?
I've done some video performances here and there, but it's not something I do that much of. And, my artistic production hasn't been so high the last couple of years. It's more been focused on the software development and just thinking about how...
Tech production, yeah.
Yeah, thinking about how we put information to computer and how we can use it to realize like some kind of composition, just like that, that kind of stuff, like Gen, really, how can I make things easy, balanced, like easy, efficient, and fun to use to do your work,
and rich also, the ability to do a rich level of work.
Yeah.
So that swings up the door, open a door to something that I think is going to resonate to a lot of listeners of this, of my podcast, which is, in order to do a lot of the things that you do, you have to have a real firm grasp of math. And I would say that a significant number of the people that get into art do so because they recognize that they couldn't stand math. Right?
Mm-hmm.
How did you find the balance there? Which came first for you? But how do you find the balance, or how do you relate to math in a way that feels artistic to you?
My favorite subject there is geometry, and geometry is this kind of mathematics where you're limited by spatial relationships, so it's constrained. It's not just like putting numbers, or messing with numbers, where it's it's not arbitrary, but it kind of seems like the rules are a little bit more loose.
Mm-hmm.
in geometry, you're highly constrained by relationships of how things can be put together.
Sure.
And it's kind of like that's more like a puzzle. So I just really enjoyed like digging into that, and the motivation just comes from like trying to understand it, and I see that the patterns that I like to, when I see like images that people generate, I really like to try and figure out exactly the processes behind them, and just enjoy creating like those kind of processes.
Yeah, interesting. And at the same time, not helpful if I wanted to get better at math, right? Um, I mean, there are certain kinds of math that came easy to me, other things that came hard, and especially when you start digging into OpenGL and you're dealing with some of the like linear algebra type processes for transforms and stuff.
Yeah.
It it's hard to find a context for that relates to art, right? Even though you know, like a transform matrix is actually artistically does something to your OpenGL thing.
Yeah. But
The,
this technology has been used in art since the Renaissance, right? That's like
right,
what drove people to be able to make these beautiful perspective paintings.
right. But somehow the way that the numbers are represented and the activity that occurs don't
Yeah.
seem to be well connected.
Yeah, you can't get lost in the numbers, that's for sure. You have to find a way to develop intuition for it, and if that's through just like visualizing things in different ways, that's how I learned, you know.
Yeah,
I would
so
just try to draw it in different ways and try and see how it worked and put a slider on it and then just see the patterns.
now it's interesting you use the word intuition because I was trying to find a right word, and maybe that's the word. One of the things I feel like about all of your work and hearing some of your background, it also implies even earlier work, is that you have a fairly good or maybe well honed intuition because you were uh, balancing engineering and photography, or you were working with live video while you were doing other things. You're playing around with art and technology pretty heavily on both sides. You've gotten to the point where, again, my first experience with your work was with the X-ray objects, and there seemed to be like a rightness about the way that you put those together. If you look at the Gen stuff, you talk specifically about trying to find the balance between efficiency and ease of use. And I would say that generally speaking, you get it right. Again, do you work with people and kind of like watch people work with your stuff? Or do you just kind of innately say, I'm going to find what's right for me and present that and see if it fits?
Yeah, so it's a combination of a lot of practice and just not. I think I don't remember. I didn't look back to see when we started on Gem, but I think it was a couple of years before it was released.
Yeah.
And I think we went through at least 20 different iterations, at least. It's like the final drawings that you see presented in a gallery are often part of a much larger complex network of sketches. And that's kind of how it is. You just have to like make something and chip away at it and hone it. And it's a lot of practice on one hand, and then also just a lot of exploration. I read everything I can get my hands on, like that's related to this kind of stuff, and just try to go deep in that. So I do my homework onto what's come before and try to understand the history of ideas in relationship to what I'm working on.
Sure. That's really interesting. That's really cool. So at Cycling, a lot of your time was spent working with Graham when he was working a lot with the company. But then he went on to do his academic magic stuff. Who have you been working with to kind of hone this? Because again, I think that some of what you're talking about really comes from having great collaborations as well, right?
Yeah, so I mean, on the OpenGL stuff, I work with Rob Ramirez,
Mm-hmm.
but on the Gen stuff, I've been kind of flying solo since Graham moved on to teaching.
Yeah, that must be hard because again, you'd been working with Graham certainly through the Santa Barbara years, right?
Yeah, for a long time.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
must be hard to kind of lose a collaborator like that.
Yeah, I mean, he's has great intuition for interfaces and how to compose and what the structure should look like in the software level to like realize these kind of really interesting ideas. So I definitely learned a lot from him, in relationship to that. Like, at Santa Barbara, we were always trying to figure out like how would you embody create like the process of being creative in software. It was kind of one of the motivations, and so
Right.
that's one also why a lot of people learned how to program there, even if
Uh-huh.
they didn't beforehand. So Gibber, Charlie Roberts, live coding JS thing.
Yes.
There's all these like projects like that that's just like about developing your voice through your your take on what software should look like and not relying on the existing you know environment environment of that exists. Not using Photoshop or Final Cut or whatever. Just kind of really developing a voice that you realize computationally. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too because I feel like I teach a little bit here at the University of Denver, and one of the things I really enjoy seeing is kind of the breakthroughs that people come up with when they're the first time they're able to find a little bit of their voice in code. You know, it's they may have found their voice up to this point with Final Cut or with Photoshop or with whatever, but the first time that they're able to find their voice with code, it's almost always in some way related to giving up a little control and allowing a system to work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to watch that happen because it's so unlike what you do in the hyper control world of Final Cut or Photoshop or Illustrator, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, with I would say that you're talking about moving towards digital fabrication. It seems like you're kind of now almost completing that circle, which is you're going back to something which is going to be very concrete
Mm-hmm.
and very much not very. You pretty much don't want to give up control. You want to get back to the point of maintaining some significant control. Is that something that you want to sort of influence, or is that a place where you feel like you can be specifically creative?
Absolutely. There's a big gap in the software for doing 3D printing and these other kind of processes. It's very coming from a very engineering mindset,
Uh huh.
and the technology is changing so fast. There's new kinds of materials, like in the last couple of months, I've seen magnetic materials, conductive materials, 3D printed batteries.
Yeah.
You can do whole assemblies, just with the printer. There are limitations to it. Obviously, it's not just like the magic tool for everything,
Right.
but it's pretty and you can do gradients of materials, so you can gradually mix rubber into hard plastic and transparency and all this kind of stuff. So you can do some things that have like just incredible properties and movement and shapes, but making those is a really labor intensive process right now.
Mm-hmm.
So one of our goals is to improve the productivity and by token the capacity for creating like interesting objects.
Oh, interesting. I think one of the things that maybe needs to be defined here is that by 3D, I would say most people, if they've been around 3D printing at all, it's been like the kind of maker bot thing, where it'll poop out a key fob for your, for your car keys.
Sure.
And even then, 2 times out of 3, it's going to fold in on itself before you even actually get to the car.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're talking about much more high-end stuff, but at that high end, it gets kind of freakish.
Yeah. So, once you get 10,000, I guess, or maybe even 100,000 and above in terms of the machine,
Uh-huh.
it's pretty incredible how precise, how detailed you can make things and how varied you can make the materials. So specifically, I think it's called the Objet machine, the Connex 500, I think it's called. So there's a great place here in San Francisco called Pier 9, which is run by Autodesk.
Yeah.
And it's under Instructables, which Autodesk owns. So they have an artist in residency program, and they have 4 of these machines, plus a bunch of other things, and a whole CNC lab with water jets, mills. Basically, if you can, any tool you can imagine to make anything, they have.
Right.
And you can apply through Instructables for artist in residency and get access. And they pay for the materials, because 3D printing isn't cheap. Right. Especially on these high-end machines.
Sure.
So you can do some incredible stuff there. So I would highly recommend applying if anyone's interested in this kind of stuff, because they have people who can teach you and help you get into it if you don't know anything about it even. So that's kind of where I started poking my, like Reza, who we interviewed a while ago. He was there, and so I was just tagging along, hanging out with him there, and that's kind of how. I was also doing some stuff at the what do they call Tech Shop in SF? Yeah. So I've been going there a little bit and working with the laser cutters and 3D printers, and just kind of slowly getting into it. Because like I mentioned, I'm really into spatial stuff, geometry, and moving away from dynamic stuff more into constructed forms.
Sure.
So I had some projects that I've been working on using these kind of technologies.
Well, that's fantastic. Wesley, I want to thank you for spending the time with us. This has really been fascinating. We kind of burned through the better part of an hour really quickly and really got a chance to peer into your mind a little bit, which I think is fascinating because, again, I think that the kind of work that you do is a little bit mind-blowing and maybe a little intimidating for a lot of people, and I think just hearing you talk about it in such artistic terms is really interesting and really inspirational.
Well, thank you, Darwin. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, thanks again, and hopefully I'll talk again to you soon.
Okay, take care.
All right, bye. All right, well, the family's biting at my heels here to start being able to make noise again, so I'm going to sign off right quickly. But thanks again to Wesley for doing the interview. It was really interesting. We wish him well as he moves on to the next phase of his life. And I want to thank everybody out there. This is the last podcast for the year. I want to thank everybody for the great listenership and for the great feedback you've given me. And I hope you have a fantastic new year. Bye.